Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk about governance today, we throw around these big terms.
International law, judicial oversight.
Exactly. And this core idea of holding high officials personally responsible for what they do, we tend to think of that concept, the idea that a president or a general or, a king is not above the law, as this really sophisticated modern thing, something born out of the Enlightenment, or maybe most famously, after World War II.
But that linear view of history, it can be really misleading. This idea that progress always moves from, darkness to light.
Right.
What if the most fundamental ethical principle for governing power? That accountability has to apply to everyone without fear or favor. What if that was established over 1,000 years before our modern systems even existed?
So we're not talking about invention in the 20th century.
No, we're talking about rediscovery.
And that is the absolute core of what we're diving into today. Our sources look at this extraordinary connection, a legal and ethical one, that stretches across 1,300 years.
Yeah, it's an amazing comparison.
We're connecting the institutional framework for state accountability that was laid down by Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab back in the 7th century with what is, it's the cornerstone of modern international justice, the Nuremberg trials.
1945-46.
Yeah.
What we're doing here is really an investigation into the ratio dissident.
The underlying reason for the decision.
Exactly. The thing that defines what true justice is, no matter what the cultural setting is. We're tracing the shared ethical thread, and it shows that, knowledge is cyclical. And the answer to unchecked power was understood, fully understood, in this vast, sprawling empire long before it was hammered out in a courtroom after a global catastrophe.
So the mission for this deep dive is to focus squarely on that, the accountability of rulers. We're asking, how can two systems separated by just vast gulfs of time, geography, legal tradition?
One is founded on moral truth, religious principle, the other on painstakingly written secular international law.
How did they both arrive at the exact same conclusion about the limits of power and, the personal responsibility of leaders?
And that conclusion is ultimately that justice is greater than the throne. It's universal.
It has to be.
Both systems, at their peak, they were forced to confront this fundamental danger, the danger of what happens when you delegate absolute power. And both of them reacted by creating these revolutionary structures that proved official authority is a trust.
Not a shield.
Not a shield. That's the perfect way to put it.
The scale of this is it's staggering. A 7th century administrative machine compared with the global judicial response to, industrialized genocide. But the shared principle is, as our sources really highlight, it's undeniable.
And let's just remember the context for both. It's important. For Umar, the big challenge was preventing this brand new state from collapsing because of internal corruption and, local tyrants popping up everywhere.
Yeah.
At Nuremberg, the challenge was preventing civilization from collapsing because of state-sponsored horror. So, different stakes. But the solution they found was identical: individual accountability.
Okay, let's jump right in. Part 1, the birth of state accountability. The Umar model.
To get this, we first have to really grasp the sheer scale of the caliphate under Umar ibn al-Khattab, 7th century. This was an empire that, in an incredibly short amount of time, stretched all the way from North Africa deep into Persia.
And it wasn't just, grabbing land. It was absorbing these highly developed ancient administrative systems, Byzantine, Sasanian. And the sources are clear on this. When we study this era, we almost always focus on the military stuff, the strategy, the swift conquest.
The maps with the expanding borders.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the analysis we're using today really emphasizes that Umar's most lasting achievement, the reason his reign actually brought stability instead of just breaking apart, was something much quieter than a battle. It was the institutionalization of accountability for every single ruler and administrator under him.
And you have to see the challenge he was facing. It was immediate. The caliphate, by necessity, was decentralized.
It had to be.
It had to be. You had governors who were hundreds, maybe thousands of miles away from the capital in Medina. And in that era, distance equals autonomy.
Right. No Zoom calls.
No Zoom calls, no email. A governor can basically become a king in his own province, ruling absolutely with no one watching. Umar's system was designed specifically to fight that natural tendency of power.
The tendency to corrupt when it's far from the center.
Precisely.
So this brings us to that foundational principle. Accountability applied without fear or favor. And the sources argue this wasn't just a nice idea of a philosophy.
Yeah.
It was a functioning administrative system.
It was a machine.
The actual birth of what we now call state accountability,
Yeah.
1,200 years before we came up with it.
And that's a really compelling argument, because if you look at history, in most absolute monarchies, officials were accountable to what? The king's personal whim.
Or how much money they were bringing in.
Or the treasury. Not to some abstract concept of justice for the people they were governing. Umar set up a system where justice was owed directly to the population, to the subjects, regardless of what the Caliph himself might have personally preferred.
And think about the tools he didn't have. No instant communication, no centralized data, no huge professional bureaucracy trained in, legal auditing.
None of it.
So this system had to rely on something else. It had to rely on moral force and swift, unequivocal punishment to be effective.
And that moral force was defined by an ethical standard that it turned the traditional hierarchy on its head. The sources give us Umar's principle directly, and it is startling. It is so clear, he said. The most dishonored person is the ruler who oppresses. The most honored person is the weak whose rights are protected.
Wow. Okay, that's not just a nice saying. That is a revolutionary administrative decree.
It is.
It means that the worth of your entire state, your entire government, is not judged by how rich your capital is or how strong your armies are, but by how well you protect the least powerful person from the actions of your most powerful official.
Yes. The person with the most power carries the highest risk of dishonor. It's a complete inversion.
And it also defined oppression really broadly. It wasn't just, violence.
No, not at all. Oppression could be economic, it could be administrative, it could just be harsh treatment. And this principle, this was the yardstick all the governors were measured against. And its enforcement brings us right to the next point. Accountability in action. Dismissal of governors.
Yeah, our sources get into the specific reasons Umar didn't just, slap them on the wrist. He fired them outright. And these weren't for minor things. These were structural failures in governance that Umar saw as, intolerable to the state's stability.
And we should spend some time on these 4 reasons because they show an administrative sophistication that is just. It's genuinely stunning for the 7th century.
Okay, so let's start with the first one, harshness. Just harsh treatment of subjects. I mean, that's subjective, right? How do you quantify that? How do you confirm harshness without some kind of modern judicial review?
He relied on a system of constant reporting and access. The caliphate wasn't passive. Governors, yes, they had to send regular reports on finance and administration, but, and this is the crucial part, Umar kept an open-door policy for any citizen traveling from the provinces to Medina.
So anyone could just show up and complain?
Anyone. And he would also send out his own agents, sometimes secretly, to just go and investigate conditions and listen for complaints. The second, a pattern of arbitrary cruelty or, unnecessary severity was established. That governor was compromised.
So ethical failure was a punishable offense,
Yeah.
even if no specific written law was broken.
Exactly. And the immediate implication of punishing harshness is that it forces your governors to act justly, not just efficiently.
Right. You couldn't say, collect 100% of your taxes by torturing people.
Because the methods themselves were punishable. The method superseded the result. If you successfully conquered a new region but abused the local population, your conquest was seen as a moral failure and your job was gone.
Okay, next one. Financial misconduct. This is a huge one. In an era of, rapid expansion, huge amounts of wealth flowing in,
Yeah.
how did Umar police the difference between a governor's personal wealth and the state treasury, especially when these officials often funded their own armies?
This is where his administrative rigor really shines. He implemented a primitive but very effective form of asset disclosure.
Wow.
Yeah. Governors were often required to declare their wealth when they took office. Then, if they were recalled or dismissed and their wealth had suddenly ballooned, inexplicably,
They'd be subject to an inquiry.
a financial inquiry, and often a seizure of any assets that were deemed to be illegally obtained. It was a proactive way to fight corruption, and it sent an extremely clear message about the sanctity of public money. He treated public office like a contract, and it had clear financial boundaries.
Okay, reason 3, misuse of authority. This feels like a bit of a catch-all. Abuse of power that isn't strictly money or cruelty.
It is, but it's about the arbitrary exercise of localized tyranny, exceeding your mandate. For instance, using your official position to go and settle a personal grudge.
Or acting outside the established legal system.
Precisely. It's all about maintaining the rule of law. If a governor started acting like a rogue king, they immediately delegitimized the central government in Medina. So by firing them, Umar was asserting that the institution of the caliphate was stronger than the personality of any individual governor.
And the fourth reason, favoritism. This one directly attacks the idea of a meritocracy.
Favoritism or, cronyism, it's poison to a new state. When you start making appointments based on personal loyalty or who you're related to rather than who's actually competent,
your administration just gets weak, inefficient.
And it starts to fracture from the inside. Umar recognized that high office was a sacred trust, and giving that trust to incompetent family members or, his buddies, just because he liked them, that was a violation of the trust he held for the public. So by removing officials for favoritism, he put effectiveness and the public's perception of fairness above his own personal loyalties.
This level of detailed oversight is what makes the case study of Amr ibn al as the governor of Egypt so incredibly powerful. I mean, this was not some small-time official who got caught skimming taxes. This was the conqueror of Egypt, one of the most powerful, influential men in the entire empire.
To challenge Amr ibn al-As was to risk a major political crisis. He had massive loyalty, he governed a vital province, he had unparalleled military success. But the system demanded accountability, no matter how politically inconvenient it was.
The source material focuses on one very specific incident, and it's worth going into the details. A man, a common citizen, travels all the way to Medina to complain directly to the Caliph.
And the complaint was specifically about harsh treatment. Amr ibn al-As had, according to the sources, struck the man with a whip after some kind of dispute.
And this detail is so important because it highlights the nature of the crime. It was a personal indignity, a use of power just to humiliate someone. It wasn't genocide or mass corruption. It was the arbitrary physical violation of one citizen's dignity by the highest authority in the land.
And when this complainant arrives, Umar's handling of the situation is just. It's the ultimate theater of justice. He summons Amr ibn al-As immediately, but first, the most crucial step. He made sure the complainant could speak freely. He guaranteed his safety.
He made him feel comfortable enough to accuse the most powerful official in Egypt directly to the head of state.
Yes, and that establishes procedural fairness, which is often so much harder to achieve than just punishment. When you're the victim, your biggest fear is retaliation. By guaranteeing this man protection and access, Umar removed that fear. It gave credibility to the entire proceeding.
And the visual of the confrontation is what makes this moment so historic. The sources tell us that Umar asked the governor to stand before the complainant like any ordinary citizen.
That symbolic gesture is just. It's profound. Amr ibn al-As, who's used to a throne, a military entourage, he was stripped of all of that. He had to physically stand there, exposed, while the wronged citizen was given the authority to speak truth to power. This is the physical manifestation of the principle that the law applies to the person, not the office.
And the climax of it all is when Umar delivers his core administrative statement, the one that really defined the relationship between the state and its people. He says, "I appoint you not to rule over the people, but to guard their rights."
That single phrase is a perfect definition of fiduciary duty. It says, your job is protection, not domination. And if you fail in that duty of protection, you are violating the contract of your appointment.
And Amr ibn al-As was required to apologize and let the complainant reciprocate the blow, a powerful act of restorative justice that reestablished their equality.
But to really hammer home that this system was completely impartial, our sources point to the ultimate test. Umar punishing his own son Ubaydullah for misconduct.
If the system had a loophole, this would be it. The ruler's own family.
Exactly. Historically, dynasties shield their own. Ubaydullah was involved in some kind of misconduct related to, I think, the distribution of war spoils. It was a breach of public trust, and Umar did not hesitate.
The cultural difficulty of this. You can't overstate it. To publicly punish your own child, especially the child of a leader, you risk political embarrassment and family fracture, challenges to your dynasty.
But Umar stressed that no one, regardless of how close they were to the highest authority, was immune.
By allowing his son to be subjected to the law's punishment, he reinforced the message from the Umar ibn al-As case, but with even greater moral force.
The law is blind. Its supremacy is non-negotiable, even for the Caliph himself. He showed that the integrity of the state depended on being willing to sacrifice personal ties for the sake of public justice.
So the legacy of this 7th century system is clear. It institutionalized the idea that accountability is a structural necessity for a stable state. It was enforceable in real time based on a high ethical standard, and that profound principle established at the very beginning of an empire. It leads us directly to part two, the parallel. Nuremberg and individualized tyranny.
So now we take this massive leap, 1,300 years. We go from the nascent caliphate in the 7th century to the shattered landscape of post-World War II Europe, mid-20th century. The administrative complexity, the technology, the sheer scale of state power, everything is different.
Everything.
And yet the fundamental moral and legal challenge was identical. How do you hold the highest officials of a powerful state accountable for crimes they committed under the guise of official duty?
So we're setting the scene for the Nuremberg trials,
Yeah.
45 to 46. The sources really emphasized the global shock after the war. The world had just seen state power turned into an industrial machine for mass murder. So the Allies decided to put 24 of the top Nazi leaders, the architects of the whole regime, on trial.
And this was a huge legal and moral crossroads. There was this absolute moral necessity for justice, but legally the path forward was, well, it was murky. Traditional international law focused on states, not on individuals. Which brings us to the unprecedented nature of the trials in the modern era.
Right. For the first time in modern history, you have generals, ministers, propagandists, state officials, all being tried as individuals. And the specific goal was to remove the shield of the state.
We should define what that shield actually was. It's the concept of sovereign immunity. Historically, state officials, especially the high-ranking ones, operated under the assumption that their actions, when they were done on behalf of the state, were protected.
So if the Nazi state ordered the murder of millions, that was traditionally seen as an act of state sovereignty.
Exactly. The individuals carrying out the orders couldn't be held personally liable by an outside court. They were just, following the laws of their country.
So if Nuremberg hadn't pierced that shield, the only entity that could have been judged would be the German state itself, maybe through reparations or political dissolution. But the individuals, Goering, Hess, Speer, they'd walk free, claiming they were just doing their job.
Precisely. Nuremberg was revolutionary because it established the principle of individual international criminal liability. The judges essentially said that high officials have duties to humanity that transcend their duties to their own national government.
So the defense of "I was acting for the state" was ruled irrelevant if the act violated these fundamental laws of humanity.
It dismantled centuries of legal tradition.
The list of crimes these leaders were tried for went on to define the future of international law. The sources list 4 categories: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression. It's really critical to understand the distinctions here to get Nuremberg's legacy.
We have to start with war crimes. These were sort of established violations of the rules of warfare, mistreating prisoners of war, targeting hospitals, things like that. These laws existed before World War II, codified in the Hague and Geneva Conventions. The Nazis clearly violated them.
Sure. But the real legal innovation was in the other categories, especially crimes against humanity.
Yes. Crimes against humanity was groundbreaking because it applied to atrocities committed against civilian populations, either before or during the war. And crucially, it covered actions a state took against its own citizens.
So think of the systematic persecution of Jewish people in Germany that started years before 1939.
Under traditional international law, a state generally had the sovereign right to deal with its own citizens however it wanted.
So Nuremberg fundamentally changed the definition of sovereignty. It basically declared that domestic tyranny, when it's systematic and horrifying, is no longer just an internal matter.
Precisely. It globalized the concept of human rights. It said there's a level of moral depravity that automatically transforms a domestic act into an international crime. And this is the direct intellectual successor to Umar's insistence that state power must not oppress its own subjects, just on a terrifyingly larger scale.
And then there was the charge of aggression, or crimes against peace. This one was highly controversial at the time.
It was. It was a direct challenge to the idea that states have a sovereign right to wage war whenever they choose. Nuremberg established that the very act of planning, initiating, or waging a war of aggression is itself an international crime.
So it held the highest political and military planners personally responsible for the catastrophe of the war itself.
Yes, the goal was to make future wars of aggression, planned by authoritarian regimes, much riskier for the planners.
The ultimate synthesis of all these principles is what we call the Nuremberg Principle, the landmark legal precedent that really echoes Umar's insistence on personal duty. The judges declared, in no uncertain terms, following orders is not a defense.
And this is the legal twin of Umar's ethical principle. The Nazi defense was almost always built around bureaucracy and obedience. I was just a cog in the machine.
I was just following the Führer's command.
Exactly. The Nuremberg Principle completely dismantled that bureaucratic defense.
It insists on a personal moral calculus, that every person in the chain of command, from the minister signing the order to the general carrying it out, retain the individual capacity to refuse a criminal act.
Which means that tyranny is a series of personal choices.
Yes.
The judicial conclusions were explicit. Tyranny is a personal choice. Power carries responsibility. Leaders can be criminals. And crimes against humanity must be punished, no matter how much time has passed or what official position was held. This formalization of individual guilt set against the state apparatus is what makes Nuremberg such a towering achievement.
And what's so remarkable is that these 20th century legal architects, drawing on Enlightenment philosophy, the concept of natural law, they ended up creating the exact same functional boundaries of power that the 7th century Caliph Umar had established using religious and moral truth.
They both concluded that accountability isn't just desirable, it's necessary for the survival of the governing entity itself, or in Nuremberg's case, for the global order.
Okay, so we've established these two bookends of the principle. Now, in part 3, connecting the dots, comparative legal principles, we have to synthesize these findings. We need to understand how deep this commonality really goes.
Right. Let's use the comparison framework from our sources to structure this. We can move from the structure to immunity to the legal basis.
Perfect. Let's start with the accountability structure. In Umar's time, the governors were accountable to him, to the Caliph. He was the central authority, the highest judicial and moral check.
And at Nuremberg, the Nazi leaders were accountable to a world tribunal, an external international judicial body.
The key shared element isn't who's doing the judging. It's that the accountability mechanism is always external to the power being checked.
That is so vital. The governors couldn't judge themselves.
And the Nazi state couldn't judge itself.
The moment a system is allowed to be the ultimate judge of its own conduct, you throw the door wide open for arbitrary power. Whether that external check is a moral supreme ruler like Umar or an international legal consensus like Nuremberg, the principle is that power has to submit to a standard that is higher than itself.
Okay, next point. Immunity status. Umar's system. It offered no immunity for state officials, not even his own son.
And Nuremberg declared no immunity for war criminals regardless of their rank.
This rejection of immunity really is the keystone, isn't it?
It's essential. Immunity is the legal shield that protects the powerful from the consequences of their official actions. In both eras, the powerful figure, whether a provincial governor or a Reich minister, was forced to step out from behind the shield of their office and just stand as a person before the law.
The act of stripping that immunity is what gives the whole thing its weight.
It's everything.
Okay, then there's the distinction, the legal basis. Umar's system was based on moral truth, often from sacred texts and ethical principles.
Right. And Nuremberg's was based on international law, which was painstakingly defined, codified, and enforced through treaty and consensus.
And this is maybe the most profound point of connection.
I think so. The source of the law is radically different. One is divine revelation and moral mandate. The other is multilateral diplomacy and human consensus. And yet, both of them concluded that certain actions by rulers, oppression, corruption, mass murder, were fundamentally wrong and demanded punishment.
It suggests that the functional requirements for ethical governance are universal. It doesn't matter what jurisprudence you use to justify them?
Yes. It suggests there's a universal functional truth about power, that it have to be checked, that just transcends any religious or cultural differences.
The standard of conduct they arrived at is identical, even if the philosophical path to get there was completely different.
The law, whether it's moral or codified, has to protect the vulnerable from the arbitrary decisions of the powerful.
Okay, finally, the protection focus. In Umar's time, the focus was on protecting citizens from power, local accountability, administrative justice for subjects against their governors.
And at Nuremberg, the focus was on protecting humanity from tyrants. It was a global concern with state-level organized crime.
So that difference in scale just reflects the evolution of the state's capacity for destruction.
Of course. In the 7th century, the biggest threat was localized abuse, harsh tax collection, petty corruption. In the 20th century, the state had the capacity for industrialized genocide and global war. The principle is the same: protect the weak from the destructive power of the state, but the scale of the threat demanded a global response.
Which brings us to the ultimate point, the ultimate commonality, ratio decidendi. We have to define the shared ethical thread that binds these two eras.
And the definitive statement from our source material just encapsulates it perfectly. Power does not shield wrongdoing. The higher the authority, the greater the responsibility.
That's the underlying moral arithmetic of both systems.
It is. When you're given authority, say, to govern Egypt or to run the Reich Air Force, your margin for error just shrinks to zero. Your capacity for harm is magnified, and so your personal standard of ethical conduct has to be maximized.
Caliph Umar held his governors to a standard of near perfection. He expected total ethical fidelity because their misconduct could affect hundreds of thousands of people.
And the Nuremberg judges applied that exact same principle. They found that the vast power and organization of the Nazi state made the individual crimes of its leaders exponentially worse.
What's so fascinating is that this principle is inherently counterintuitive to power itself. Power always seeks to protect itself. It seeks immunity.
Always.
And both Umar's system and the Nuremberg Tribunal created a mechanism to overcome that natural tendency, demonstrating that the health and legitimacy of the state, or the international community, had to come before the protection of its most powerful individuals.
And it really raises this profound idea that the legal struggle against arbitrary power is eternal. The tools change, you know. A 7th century public whip versus a 20th century international charter, but the core ethical need for the system to sacrifice its most powerful members in service of justice remains the same.
And this historical synchronicity is what validates the entire concept. If an ethical principle shows up spontaneously in two radically different contexts across 1,300 years.
It suggests it's a universal truth about effective governance, not just a cultural preference.
Okay, let's move into part 4, the lasting impact, and bring this discussion to its contemporary relevance and, our final conclusions. We're looking at a dual legacy here that defines the relationship between the ruler and the ruled.
On the one hand, you have Umar. He established the earliest sophisticated model of ethical governance we know of, a real-time functioning administrative system based on moral fidelity and internal oversight. His system gave us a blueprint for how a state can ensure its own legitimacy and stability through self-correction.
And then on the other hand, you have Nuremberg, which created modern international criminal law. It established the principle that aggression and mass human rights violations aren't just political acts, they are punishable crimes under universal jurisdiction.
And that laid the foundation for every subsequent international tribunal, the International Criminal Court, the prosecutions for atrocities in places like the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda.
So, in essence, Umar proved that internal accountability builds a lasting state.
And Nuremberg proved that external accountability protects global civilization.
And both establish the same eternal principle. Rulers must be judged because justice is absolutely and without any exception greater than the throne.
The ultimate moral statement from the source material is so powerful, and it should resonate with every leader and citizen today. A state survives not by its armies, but by holding its rulers accountable.
That is the definition of true stability.
It is. Military might can impose order for a while, but legitimacy comes from perceived fairness. If a citizen knows that the most powerful official can be challenged, that the governor can be made to stand there like an ordinary man, or that the minister can be tried for war crimes, then their faith in the system endures. Accountability is the lubricant that prevents the friction of corruption and tyranny from breaking the social contract.
And this analysis, we should note, comes from the work of Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir, who is a constitutional and corporate lawyer and a prolific author. And that gives it significant weight because you have a jurist linking these principles.
Right. He's arguing that the moral spine of modern constitutional and international law has these deep, successful, ancient precedents. He's providing a critical perspective. The challenge of state building isn't unique to our time. The problems of delegating power, corruption, the lure of tyranny, they're constant.
And the most successful, long-lasting solutions, the ones that prioritize protecting the weak over the privilege of the powerful, are equally constant.
So why should you, our listener, care so deeply about a 7th century caliphate and a 20th century tribunal?
Because the failure of accountability is the most reliable predictor of societal breakdown. When accountability systems fail, whether it was historically in a decentralized empire or it's today in a centralized democracy, the state forfeits its moral authority. And eventually it either collapses from within or it lashes out externally.
The ability of a system to confront its own highest power is what defines its health. Umar's legacy is a model of proactive administrative accountability. Nuremberg's legacy is a model of reactive international justice. Both offer profound lessons on governance.
And that brings us to our final conclusions.
So what does this all mean? We have seen how the concepts of ethical governance, focused on the individual dignity of the subject under Umar, and the foundation of international criminal law, focused on protecting all of humanity at Nuremberg, are fundamentally rooted in the same moral imperative.
They both insist that title, rank, and position can never serve as a defense against crime.
We've explored this profound historical realization that power carries responsibility, and that legal systems must, even at great political and administrative cost, evolve to ensure that the higher the authority, the higher the standard of behavior.
So the ultimate question for you to consider is this. We've seen justice pierce the shield of the local official and the shield of the sovereign state. In our current era of rapidly evolving globalized power, where actors include, transnational corporations, powerful non-state military groups, cyber actors operating with state-like authority, what new shield will the law need to pierce next to ensure that accountability remains functionally paramount? What structure will define the boundaries of power in the 21st century?